On a sweltering August morning in 1953, a man with wire-rimmed glasses and a high forehead stepped off a plane in Tehran. His name was Kermit Roosevelt Jr. He carried no weapons, no official credentials, just a briefcase stuffed with cash and the weight of two empires on his shoulders. Within 6 days, this quiet American bureaucrat would orchestrate the overthrow of a democratically elected government, crush a nation's dream of independence, and set in motion a chain of events that would explode into revolution 26 years later. The operation would be called Ajax, named after a household cleaning product famous for scouring away stubborn stains. But what Roosevelt was about to scrub from history wasn't dirt. It was democracy itself, and the stain he left behind would never wash out. This is the story of how a bankrupt Britain, desperate to save itself from economic collapse, convinced America to destroy Iran's future, and how that single decision in 1953 created the Middle East we're still fighting over today. In the blistering heat of the Persian Gulf, sitting on a mud flat in the Shatt al-Arab waterway, stood the single most valuable piece of real estate in the British Empire. It wasn't a gold mine in South Africa. It wasn't a tea plantation in India. It was a sprawling tangle of steel pipes, cooling towers, and smokestacks known as the Abadan Refinery. In 1951, this facility was the largest oil refinery on the planet. It covered a square mile of desert. It processed 25 million tons of crude oil a year, and every single drop of that oil, every penny of profit generated by the black blood pumping through those pipes, belonged to a company called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. To the British government, sitting 4,000 miles away in the grey drizzle of London, Abadan wasn't just an industrial asset. It was a life support machine. The British Empire had emerged from the Second World War victorious, but destitute. The national treasury was empty, drained to pay for the fight against Hitler. The country was drowning in debt owed to the United States. The British people were living on rations, eating powdered eggs and wearing utility clothing. The only thing keeping the British economy from total collapse was the hard currency earned by its overseas assets, and by far the biggest earner was Iranian oil. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which we know today as BP, was essentially a state within a state. It generated millions of pounds in revenue that flowed directly into the British exchequer. It fueled the Royal Navy. It provided the energy for the factories of the Midlands. It was the financial lung that allowed a shrinking empire to keep breathing. The British government owned 51% of the company. Every barrel of Iranian oil that flowed to market was a breath of air for a drowning nation. But there was a problem. This massive engine of wealth was located in a country that was waking up. Iran was an ancient civilization with a proud history for the first half of the 20th century. However, it had been treated as little more than a colonial resource extraction zone. The British ran the oil industry in Iran with a level of arrogance that is difficult to comprehend today. In Abadan, the British administrators lived in a segregated enclave that looked like an English suburb. They had cricket pitches, manicured lawns, swimming pools, air-conditioned bungalows. They imported their food from London. They drank gin and tonics on verandas while just outside the fence. Iranian workers lived in shanty towns made of flattened oil drums. There was no running water, no electricity. The heat was unbearable, often reaching 120 degrees. The workers were paid pennies. They had no rights. They were treated as coolies in their own country. The injustice was mathematical. In 1950 alone, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company made a profit of £170 million. They paid the Iranian government less than £16 million in royalties. Read that again. The British government collected more in taxes from the company than the Iranian government received for its own natural resources. Britain was getting rich while Iran stayed poor, all from Iranian oil flowing through Iranian soil. For decades, the Iranians had simmered with resentment. But in 1951, that resentment reached a boiling point. Enter Mohammad Mossadegh. He was 71 years old, an aristocrat with Swiss legal training, a member of Iran's ruling elite who had turned against his own class. He was theatrical, emotional, Often conducting political business from his bed in silk pajamas, he wept in public. He fainted during speeches. Western diplomats thought he was unstable, a hysteric. But the Iranian people saw something different. They saw a man who felt their humiliation as his own. Mossadegh had a simple message. Iranian oil belongs to Iranians, not to Britain, not to any foreign power. To Iran. This wasn't communism. This wasn't anti-Western ideology. This was nationalism. In its purest form, a demand for dignity, for sovereignty, for the basic right of a nation to control its own resources. On March 15, 1951, the Iranian parliament, the Majlis, held a vote on oil nationalization. It passed unanimously. Not a single dissenting voice. The wave of public support was so overwhelming that even politicians in the pockets of foreign interests didn't dare oppose it. The Prime Minister at the time, Hussein Ala, immediately resigned, recognizing he had no power in the face of this tidal wave of nationalist sentiment. On May 1, 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh was appointed Prime Minister. Within hours, he signed the law that nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and replaced it with the National Iranian Oil Company. Control of Iran's oil industry had been transferred from British hands to Iranian hands, on paper, at least, in London. The reaction was volcanic. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, saw the nationalization as theft, pure and simple. Britain had spent decades building the infrastructure in Iran. British engineers had found the oil. British capital had developed the fields. And now these ungrateful Persians were simply taking it. Unacceptable, but Britain's options were limited. The empire that had once ruled a quarter of the globe was now broke. Britain couldn't afford a full-scale military invasion of Iran. It tried. British troops briefly attacked the island of Abadan to seize the refinery. But the political costs were too high. The world had changed. Colonialism was dying. The old methods wouldn't work anymore. So Britain turned to economic warfare. It imposed a worldwide boycott of Iranian oil. British warships blockaded Iranian ports. The Royal Navy threatened any tanker that tried to carry Iranian crude to market. Britain took the case to the International Court of Justice, demanding that the 1933 oil agreement be upheld. In July 1952, the court delivered a humiliating blow. It ruled it had no jurisdiction in the matter. Iran had won, legally, at least. But winning in court didn't mean winning in reality. The British boycott was devastating. Iran's oil exports dropped to nearly zero. In the first year of nationalization, Iran sold exactly 300 barrels of oil to a single Italian merchant ship. That's it. The economy began to collapse. Government revenues evaporated. Unemployment soared. The very thing Mossadegh had fought for, control of Iranian oil, was becoming worthless because he couldn't sell it. Mossadegh believed, genuinely, that America would help. The United States, after all, wasn't a colonial power like Britain. America had a history of supporting nationalist movements, of advocating for self-determination. Surely Washington would understand that Iran's demand for sovereignty was just. He was catastrophically wrong. President Harry Truman had indeed been sympathetic to Mossadegh. Truman saw him as a nationalist, not a communist. He pressured Britain to negotiate. He pushed for a compromise where Iran would maintain nominal sovereignty while sharing oil revenues, 50-50 with foreign companies, similar to the deal America had made with Saudi Arabia. But in November 1952, Dwight Eisenhower was elected president. Eisenhower brought with him a very different worldview. His administration was led by two brothers, John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State and Allen Dulles as Director of the CIA. Two Thedulles brothers. The world was simple. You were either with America or against it. Any country that wasn't decisively in the Western camp was a potential enemy, a potential communist domino waiting to fall. And Iran, sitting on an ocean of oil with a long border with the Soviet Union, could not be allowed to fall. The British knew exactly how to exploit American paranoia. They had failed to convince Truman that Mossadegh was dangerous, but with Eisenhower, they had a more receptive audience. British intelligence began feeding Washington a carefully construed narrative. Mossadegh was weak. His government was chaotic. The Communist Tada Party was growing stronger. If Mossadegh stayed in power, Iran would collapse into communist hands. The Soviet Union would gain control of Iranian oil. The entire Middle East would be lost. It was a masterful piece-off manipulation. The British cared about oil. The Americans cared about communism. By framing the crisis as a Cold War battle rather than a colonial dispute, Britain convinced America to do its dirty work. In March 1953, a plan began to take shape. It was developed in meetings in Cyprus and Beirut. British and American intelligence officers working together. The British had the knowledge. They knew Iran intimately. They knew which military officers could be bribed, which tribal leaders could be bought, which journalists would print propaganda. The Americans had the muscle, a large embassy staff in Tehran, diplomatic cover, and most importantly, money, lots of money. On July 1st, W.T.P. Ajax by the Americans, Operation Booty the British. The man chosen to lead it was Kermit Roosevelt Jr. Roosevelt was the perfect choice. The grandson of President Theodore Roosevelt, educated at Harvard, a career intelligence officer who had proven himself during World War II, soft-spoken, polite, utterly unassuming. As one colleague later said, he was the last person you'd expect to be up to his neck in dirty tricks. But that colleague was Kim Philby, the British double agent, so perhaps he recognized a kindred spirit. Roosevelt arrived in Tehran on July 19, 1953. He entered the country in secret. No official visa, no diplomatic status, just a man with a mission and a briefcase full of cash. Over the next month, he worked methodically to tear apart Mossadegh's government from the inside. The plan was elegant in its cynicism. Roosevelt's team bribed newspaper editors to print stories portraying Mossadegh as a communist sympathizer, a dangerous radical planning to abolish the monarchy and establish a Soviet-backed republic. They created fake documents suggesting Mossadegh would confiscate religious properties. They hired crowds to stage demonstrations, both pro and anti-Mossadegh, creating an atmosphere of chaos and instability. They paid thugs from South Tehran slums and athletic clubs to riot in the streets. Most importantly, they coordinated with Iranian military officers who opposed Mossadegh, ensuring that when the moment came, the army would move against him. The first coup attempt came on August 15th. It failed spectacularly. Mossadegh's loyalists arrested the Shah's messenger, the young Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, panicked and fled the country, first to Baghdad, then to Rome. Massive pro-Mossadegh demonstrations started in Tehran. Communist Tada Party members took to the streets. In celebration, it looked like Operation Ajax had been crushed before it even started. CIA headquarters in Washington sent Roosevelt an urgent message: abort the mission and evacuate. The operation was over, but Roosevelt refused to leave. He believed he could still turn the situation around. And he was right. The turning point came when Mossadegh made a critical mistake, seeing the chaos in the streets. Fearing his supporters would lose control, he ordered everyone to go home and return to normal life. The demonstrations stopped. The Tada Party militants went home. The streets emptied. Mossadegh thought he had stabilized the situation. He had actually created a vacuum, and Roosevelt filled it. On August 19th, for days after the first failed attempt, Roosevelt's remaining assets launched a second coup. General Fazlollah Zahedi, a military officer who had collaborated with the Nazis during World War II and was now on the CIA payroll, rallied military units loyal to the Shah, crowds organized by CIA operatives, this time larger and more aggressive, flooded the streets. But this time they weren't chanting for Mossadegh. They were chanting for the Shah. Death to Mossadegh. Long live the Shah. The army, still largely loyal to the monarchy, moved against Mossadegh's supporters. Tank columns rolled through Tehran. Government buildings were seized. Key ministers were arrested. By the end of the day, it was over. Mossadegh's house was surrounded. He was taken into custody. General Zahedi was installed as the new Prime Minister. The Shah, hearing the news in Rome, immediately flew back to Tehran to reclaim his throne. When the Shah met Kermit Roosevelt after the coup, he was effusive in his gratitude. Roosevelt later recounted the Shah's words, "I owe my throne to God, my people, my army, and to you." By you, Thesha meant Roosevelt, and through Roosevelt, Britain, and the United States. Mossadegh was put on trial for treason. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. After serving his sentence, he was kept under house arrest for the rest of his life, dying in isolation in 1967. Hundreds of his supporters were arrested, tortured, or executed. The National Front was crushed. The dream of Iranian democracy died with it. And the oil, in 1954, a new agreement was signed. It was called the Consortium Agreement. It maintained the fiction of Iranian ownership through the National-Iranian Oil Company, but operational control was handed to an international consortium, British Petroleum. The renamed Anglo-Iranian Oil Company retained a stake. But here was the kicker. American oil companies took 40% of the profits. Britain had asked America to help restore its oil concession. America had done so. But in return, it had taken nearly half the prize for itself. Iran had fought for sovereignty and lost. Britain had fought to maintain its empire and lost control. America, ostensibly the defender of democracy and self-determination, had overthrown a democratically elected government to secure oil and fight communism. The coup was considered a brilliant success. Cheap, efficient, effective. It cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes. It took less than a month to execute. It removed a troublesome nationalist and installed a compliant monarch. The CIA was ecstatic. This was proof that covert regime change could work. Operation Ajax became the blueprint. The following year, the CIA used similar tactics to overthrow the government in Guatemala. Regime change had become a tool of American foreign policy, but the long-term costs were catastrophic, even if nobody realized it at the time. With American backing, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi transformed himself from a weak constitutional monarch into an absolute dictator. He dissolved parliament. He banned political parties. He crushed dissent. The United States helped him create SOVIC, one of the most brutal secret police forces in history. SOVIC tortured, imprisoned, and murdered thousands of Iranians, all with American training, American equipment, American approval. For 25 years, the Shah ruled with an iron fist. He launched the White Revolution, a top-down modernization program that alienated the clergy and traditional society. While enriching a corrupt elite, oil revenues poured in. Tehran glittered with wealth, but beneath the surface, resentment festered. The Shah was seen, rightly, as an American puppet. The memory of 1953 was still fresh. Everyone knew he owed his throne to the CIA. By the late 1970s, Iranian society was a pressure cooker. Economic inequality was extreme. Corruption was rampant. The secret police were everywhere. And a growing movement of radical Islamists, led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, began to mobilize against the Shah's regime. In 1979, the explosion came. Millions of Iranians took to the streets. The Shah's military crumbled. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi boarded a plane and fled Iran, never to return. 2 weeks later, Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile in Paris to a hero's welcome. The Islamic Revolution had triumphed. The revolution wasn't initially anti-American. It was anti-Shah. But the Shah was inseparable from America in the minds of Iranians. He was the man installed by the CIA in 1953, the puppet who had ruled at Washington's pleasure. When Revolutionary Guard stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran on November 4, 1979, and took 66 American diplomats hostage, they weren't just angry about the Shah's admission to the United States for cancer treatment. They were settling accounts from 1953. The hostage crisis lasted for 144 days. It humiliated America. It destroyed Jimmy Carter's presidency. It severed diplomatic relations between the United States and Iran, a break that has never been repaired. In April 1980, the United States formally cut all ties with Iran. And that brings us to today. 43 years after the hostage crisis, 71 years after Operation Ajax, the Islamic Republic of Iran remains one of America's most bitter enemies. Sanctions, proxy wars, nuclear standoffs, threats of military strikes, the entire architecture of conflict in the Middle East, from the Lebanon War to the Syrian civil war to the ongoing confrontation over Iran's nuclear program, can be traced back, in part, to the choices made in 1953. Iranian leaders still invoke a coup as proof of Western treachery. When Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei warns against trusting America, he points to 1953. When Iranian students are taught about imperialism, they learn about Mossadegh. When anti-American sentiment erupts in Tehran, it's fueled by the collective memory of a democratic government crushed by foreign powers. The coup that seemed so brilliant in 1953, so cheap and efficient, ended up costing America far more than anyone could have imagined. It poisoned relations with one of the most important countries in the Middle East. It fueled decades of revolution, war, and terrorism. It taught a generation of American policymakers that covert regime change was an acceptable tool, a lesson that would be applied disastrously in places like Vietnam, Chile, Nicaragua, and Iraq. Stephen Kinzer, historian and author, put it simply, from the perspective of a story. The coup was not successful for the United States. The 1979 revolution was a long-term effect of the increasing repression from the Shah, who came to power as a result of the coup. That Islamic revolution brought to power a fanatically anti-American regime that has spent more than 30 years working to undermine American interests all over the world. The British got their oil back for a few years, but ultimately lost everything. The empire they were trying to save with Iranian oil collapsed anyway. BP survived, but Britain's global dominance did not. The Americans got embroiled in a conflict that still shapes their foreign policy 70 years later. And Iran lost its chance at democracy. It lost a leader who, for all his flaws, genuinely believed in sovereignty and independence. It traded British colonialism for American imperialism then.
It lost a leader who, for all his flaws, genuinely believed in sovereignty and independence. It traded British colonialism for American imperialism, then traded both for Islamic theocracy. The dreams of 1951 of a modern, independent, democratic Iran controlling its own destiny were buried in the dust of the 1953 coup. Today, when you see headlines about Iran's nuclear program, or tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, or proxy conflicts across the Middle East, remember this: much of it traces back to a single decision made in the summer of 1953, a decision by a bankrupt Britain desperate to preserve its wealth, a decision by a paranoid America terrified of communism, a decision executed by a quiet man with glasses and a briefcase full of cash. Kermit Roosevelt went on to work in the private sector, consulting for oil companies. He published a memoir about the coup in 1979, presenting it as a heroic victory against communism. He died in 2000 at the age of 84, praised as a Cold War hero. Mohammad Mossadegh died in house arrest in 1967 at the age of 85, denied even the dignity of a public funeral. Iranian authorities still prohibit public visits to his grave. He is too dangerous, even in death. The oil still flows from Iran, but it flows under the control of a theocratic regime that sees America as the great Satan and Britain as the perfidious Albion. The wealth that could have built a modern, democratic Iran instead fueled revolution, war, and ongoing conflict. And somewhere in the archives, filed away in CIA headquarters and MI6 offices, lie the original plans for Operation Ajax, a reminder that sometimes the stains you try to scrub away with covert operations don't disappear. They spread, they deepen, and they last for generations.